to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the Civil War, and in this, our final lecture on that topic, we're going to talk about the process by which the Union achieves ultimate victory and the surrender of the Confederacy. In the previous lecture, I talked about the swing in momentum in the war after the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And yet, the war lingered on for another 2 years after that, and the cracks in the Confederacy were relatively slow to reveal themselves, and the process of the Confederacy crumbling extended over many months. But even after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, some of those cracks were beginning to appear. One of them was a lack of men, and the inability to fill the void left by casualties on the Confederate side. This was a problem for the Union as well, but they were able to manage it more successfully than the Confederacy. The Confederacy simply had fewer places to turn to fill the void left as casualties mounted. Things were compounded as they lost territory. In the aftermath of battles like Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Confederacy itself is starting to shrink as little chunks here and there are being lopped off by Union victories. With every defeat, they have fewer resources and fewer territory to turn to meet their growing needs. The Confederate economy was also being slowly strangled, and as the years stretched out over months and years, the economy only grew worse and worse. The Union blockade, blocking off various port cities and the coast, only grew more and more successful the longer the war went on. As more cities fell under Union control, the Confederates had fewer and fewer options to escape through the blockade. Things were only exacerbated by the Confederacy's own policy, the cotton embargo, whereby they stopped shipping cotton to other nations, most notably Britain and France. As I noted in a previous lecture, that policy hurt the Confederacy's economy almost as much as it did other economies, and in fact, more so. This was only exacerbated by the fact that the Confederacy, by refusing to ship cotton, now had fewer options when it came to purchasing and trading for other goods that they needed, like weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. If they weren't shipping out their cotton, what did they have to trade for those things? And so eventually, when they lifted the embargo in 1862, things were already well on their way to damaging the Confederate economy. The Union blockade was more successful, and Britain, which had been deprived of Confederate cotton, sought out other alternatives and needed it less once the embargo was lifted. Finally, the economy rooted in slavery suffered as well, particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation, as slaves across the South, getting word of the Emancipation Proclamation, began self-emancipating and leaving their farms and plantations and seeking refuge with the Union Army. So the Confederacy was showing serious signs of weakness as the war entered 1864. Those weaknesses were made much worse by the aggressiveness of new leadership in the Union armies. Abraham Lincoln gave total control of the Union armies to Ulysses S. Grant, who had been so successful in his various campaigns in the West, and his right-hand man, William Tecumseh Sherman, who was most famed for his march to the sea and the burning of Atlanta, but carried out with ruthless efficiency the directives that Grant put upon him. Grant and Sherman overall adopted a strategy of total war, a war of battering the Confederacy into utter submission. Grant was also much more aggressive in pursuing Robert E. Lee and other Confederate generals than previous Union generals had been. So he seized upon moments and opportunities when the Confederate Army might have been battered by one battle. He went right after them in another battle after that, whereas previous Union generals had hesitated. Grant was also willing to sacrifice huge portions of his army in full frontal assaults and direct attacks against the Confederacy because he understood what I discussed on the previous slide, that the Confederates could not replace their lost soldiers and casualties as readily as the Union forces could. So by engaging in huge battles and costing huge casualties on both sides, Grant was engaged in a ruthless and brutal tactic, but he knew that the South would fall before the North under that strategy. This is evidenced in a series of battles in the spring and early summer of 1864. The Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor. All Union victories, but all incredibly fierce, ruthless, and resulting in huge casualties on both sides. Both sides were also now understanding that death was likely in these kinds of battles. Soldiers took to pinning their names on their clothes so they could be identified in the aftermath. One diary found after the Battle of Cold Harbor read, "June 3rd, Cold Harbor, I was killed." Those three battles, which resulted in 55,000 Union casualties and 30,000 Confederate casualties, also gave pause to some in the North, particularly peace Democrats, or the so-called Copperheads, who were opposed to the war all along. As a presidential election loomed later in that year, even Grant had to recognize that destroying his own army with these kinds of full frontal assaults might prove counterproductive in the long run. And so in the last of these major engagements, the city of Petersburg, Grant rather engaged in a siege, surrounding the city and beginning to choke off rail lines and other supplies that were able to come in. The siege of Petersburg stretched on for many, many weeks. Looking back in hindsight, it might seem crazy to think that Abraham Lincoln would lose his re-election in the election of 1864. But as summer stretched into fall in that year, his re-election was by no means guaranteed. There was great dissatisfaction in the North with various aspects of the war and Lincoln's presidency. Democrats turned to George B. McClellan, we've talked about George McClellan as the former Union general, as their alternative, calling for a ceasefire and peace. As one sign that Lincoln and his campaign were worried about the election, they opted to choose as their vice presidential nominee Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, a pro-Union Democrat, so reaching out across the aisle and across the sectional divide. That selection will have dire consequences down the road, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. In September, though, the cataclysmic news that Sherman had captured Atlanta swung momentum back in Lincoln's favor, and he ultimately won the presidential election by a comfortable margin, with McClellan winning only Kentucky, New Jersey, and Delaware. Still, this election campaign and the ultimate outcome was closer than one might think for one of America's greatest presidents. In the fall and winter of 1864, Sherman engaged in his notorious March to the Sea, a scorched earth campaign in which Sherman and his soldiers tore up and destroyed essentially anything that might help the Confederate cause in terms of infrastructure, like railroad tracks, roads, bridges, telegraph wires. They burned fields and salted the earth, all in an effort to destroy the Confederate effort down to the roots. This is known as total war and became one of the hallmarks of the late stages of the Civil War, bringing the war home to the civilian population, not just the enemy army. As Sherman told his men, "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and we must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hand of war, as well as their organized armies." As yet another blow against the Confederacy and its roots, Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, which set aside more than 400,000 acres of seized Confederate land to distribute to former slaves in 40-acre plots. We will talk about the fate of that order in the future lectures about Reconstruction. By Christmas of 1864, Sherman had reached Savannah and the coast, and then turned with his armies to assist Grant in their final quest to crush Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. While it is clear to us in hindsight that the Confederacy was nearing its end, at the time they carried on their desperate fight, expanding the draft to include men as young as 17 and as old as 50. They also drafted up to 300,000 slaves to serve as soldiers. But think about that for a moment. Slaves are not going to make the greatest soldiers, and they didn't actually take the field in combat, but the thought process was there. By the spring of 1865, Grant's siege of Petersburg had taken its toll. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were deserting, others were near starving. Lee attempted one last effort to break out of the siege, but his men were cut off by General Philip Sheridan's cavalry in Appomattox, Virginia. The next day, April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox, saying, "There is nothing left but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." While other parts of the Confederate Army had yet to surrender, they would straggle in over the following weeks. The process now began towards reconciling the nation and building into what we call Reconstruction, the months and years after the Civil War. Lincoln set his tone in his second inaugural address, saying, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, the need to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Similarly, the terms against Lee and his armies were relatively generous. Confederate soldiers were allowed to go home, providing that they swore never to take up arms against the Union again. They were also given food and supplies. We will talk more about the process of Reconstruction in the next series of lectures. We can only wonder what might have happened if Lincoln and his policy with malice toward none had survived throughout the Reconstruction era. But as we all know, he didn't survive. He was assassinated on April 14th by John Wilkes Booth while watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, thus meaning that Reconstruction will turn a new page of history and fall to Andrew Johnson. As we look at some of the ultimate costs of the Civil War, and again, we'll talk more about Reconstruction in the next lecture, more than 600,000 were killed by the war, and of course, many hundred thousands more left scarred by the war. They would be walking the streets of America's towns and cities well into the next century, and so would remain a lingering evidence of this horrible conflict. There were also many difficult and profound questions to be wrestled with. What would happen to the freed slaves? What would their status be in this new society after the war? What would happen to the Union itself? How can we reconcile and re-welcome the states of the Confederacy who had just been engaged in a brutal war against our nation? Well, those are questions that we'll need to turn to in our final chapter about Reconstruction.